I never thought parking in my own driveway would turn into a legal nightmare, but the moment I saw the sheriff's citation stuck to my windshield, I knew something was seriously wrong. The crisp white paper with its bold red warning letters accused me of violating a local ordinance, except there was no such ordinance, at least none that applied to my own private property. My pulse quickened as I read the details: a hefty fine, a mandatory court appearance, and an ominous note about further consequences for noncompliance. The absurdity of it all made my blood boil, but I wasn't about to roll over and accept this injustice. What I didn't realize was that this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle, one that would drag the entire city into the chaos and expose a scandal that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The sun was barely rising when I first noticed the sheriff's car parked across the street, its dark silhouette watching my house like a silent predator. At first, I thought nothing of it. Law enforcement vehicles weren't uncommon in the neighborhood, and I had nothing to hide. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, the same sheriff's deputy would sit there, watching, waiting, until finally, that dreaded citation appeared on my car. I snatched the paper off the windshield, scanning for some logical explanation, but logic had no place in this situation. The offense? Obstruction of public access. The laughable part? My car was neatly parked in my own designated driveway, nowhere near the street, sidewalk, or any public pathway. My frustration turned to confusion, and confusion to anger. This wasn't just a mistake, this was deliberate. I stormed into my house, dropping the paper onto the kitchen counter as I pulled up the city's parking laws. I read them twice, 3 times, trying to find even the smallest justification for the citation, but nothing fit. There were no regulations about private driveways, no zoning laws that restricted how many cars a homeowner could park on their own property. The more I searched, the clearer it became: someone had either made a massive error or was intentionally targeting me. I thought back to the past few weeks, trying to piece together any reason why law enforcement would have singled me out. Nothing made sense. I wasn't behind on any taxes, I had no unpaid violations, and I wasn't on bad terms with any local officials. So why was I being harassed over something so ridiculous? Determined to get answers, I took a drive down to the sheriff's department. The waiting room was nearly empty, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and worn-out leather chairs. When I finally spoke to the clerk at the front desk, she barely looked up from her screen as she told me the citation had come directly from the sheriff himself. That was my first red flag. Standard parking violations were handled by the city's parking enforcement, not the county sheriff's office. If he was personally involved, then this wasn't just a routine ticket, it was something else entirely. I asked to speak with him, but she shook her head, informing me that he was unavailable, and that if I had concerns, I could contest the citation in court. It was a dead end. For now. I drove back home with my mind racing, each turn of the wheel tightening the knot in my gut. I knew I had to be careful. This wasn't just about an unfair ticket anymore, this was something bigger, something that reeked of corruption. The next morning, I woke up to find another citation taped to my front door, this time warning me that if I didn't move my vehicle within 24 hours, it would be towed at my expense. That was the final straw. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and made the first call. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. What I didn't know was that by the time this was over, the entire city would be watching, and the sheriff's office would have far more to answer for than just an illegal parking ticket. The moment I made the call, I knew there was no turning back. I wasn't just challenging a citation, I was challenging the authority of a sheriff who clearly believed he was untouchable. My first move was contacting the city's municipal office, determined to find out if there had been any recent changes to zoning or parking regulations that I had somehow missed. The clerk on the other end of the line hesitated for a moment before confirming what I already suspected: there were no such laws restricting homeowners from parking in their own driveways. The only relevant regulations applied to vehicles blocking public roads, alleys, or emergency access points, none of which were even remotely connected to my situation. That's when she mentioned something else, something that made my stomach churn with unease. There had been a sudden spike in parking-related fines issued within my neighborhood, all of them originating from the sheriff's office rather than the city's parking enforcement. Most of them, she noted, seemed to be concentrated around properties in a specific zone, mine included. That was no coincidence. Someone was using parking citations as a weapon, but for what purpose? I pulled up the online records of recent violations, scanning through the addresses and dates, looking for a pattern. It didn't take long to see it. The properties being hit with fines weren't random, they were clustered together, forming a perfect line that ran through my neighborhood. At first, it didn't make sense, but then I cross-referenced them with a map of proposed city developments, and suddenly, everything clicked into place. A new commercial project had been in discussion for months, a high-end shopping district that would require significant property acquisitions to proceed. The city had been slow to approve it, mainly due to residents resisting the idea of selling their homes. If people refused to move voluntarily, there were other ways to force them out. Harassment through fines, legal pressure, and threats disguised as official notices. It wasn't just about me, it was about control, about coercing people into compliance through intimidation. My heart pounded as I printed copies of every citation, every document that linked back to the sheriff's office. This was no ordinary abuse of power, this was targeted, systematic, and methodical. If I was right, then the sheriff wasn't acting alone. Someone had something to gain from this, and I had a strong feeling it involved money, development deals, and backdoor politics. But speculation wasn't enough, I needed undeniable proof, and for that, I needed help. That's when I decided to take the fight to the city council. If I wanted real answers, I had to go higher than the sheriff's office. I gathered everything I had, packed it into a folder, and drove straight to the municipal building. The moment I walked through the doors, I could feel the weight of what I was about to do. If I exposed this, I wasn't just putting myself on the radar, I was putting a target on my back. The receptionist barely concealed her surprise when I requested an immediate meeting with a city official regarding an urgent legal matter. It wasn't every day that a resident demanded to speak directly with someone in power, but the moment I mentioned the sheriff's name and the questionable parking fines, her expression changed. Within minutes, I was ushered into a conference room, my hands gripping the folder as I laid out everything I had uncovered. The city official across from me listened in silence, occasionally flipping through the documents with a frown. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally looked up, his face unreadable. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to dismiss my claims or tell me I was mistaken. Instead, he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told me something that sent a chill down my spine. The sheriff had been under investigation for months, but until now, there had been no concrete evidence to tie him to anything illegal. My case, my documentation, was the missing piece they had been waiting for. The air in the room felt heavy as the realization set in. I wasn't just fighting a bogus citation anymore, I was exposing a scheme that ran far deeper than I had imagined. If the sheriff had been abusing his power to push residents out, then there was a whole network of people involved, people who stood to gain from every property that was forcibly vacated. The city official wasted no time contacting the district attorney's office, and within the hour, legal teams were already reviewing the case. But just as I thought I had the upper hand, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my stomach drop. A tow truck had just pulled up outside my house, accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies, ready to seize my vehicle under the pretense of an unpaid fine. They weren't just fighting back, they were escalating. I was no longer dealing with petty harassment. This was war. I rushed out of the municipal building, my pulse hammering as I pulled up the live feed from my security cameras. The tow truck idled in my driveway, its engine rumbling like a predator ready to pounce. 2 sheriff's deputies stood beside it, their arms crossed, their presence a silent warning. I could see my car still parked exactly where it had been for years, untouched, unblocked, and undeniably within my legal rights. Yet that didn't seem to matter. They had escalated their tactics, turning what should have been a simple parking dispute into an outright display of force. I had expected retaliation, but not this fast, not this brazen. I had to act, and I had to act now. I slammed the car into drive, weaving through traffic as I sped toward home, my mind racing through every possible move I had left. The city was already involved, the district attorney's office had been alerted, but none of that mattered if they got away with towing my vehicle under false pretenses. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore, they were trying to make an example out of me. By the time I pulled into my street, neighbors had already gathered on their porches, watching the scene unfold with hushed whispers and wary glances. They had seen it before, the quiet ways people were pressured, the mysterious fines that seemed to target certain properties, the sudden departures of families who had once sworn they'd never leave. But now, for the first time, someone was fighting back, and they were witnessing just how far those in power were willing to go to maintain control. I stepped out of my car and walked straight toward the deputies, my every move calculated, my voice steady despite the anger coiling in my chest. I demanded an explanation, though I already knew the answer. The deputy closest to me, a man whose expression was as rigid as stone, simply handed me another citation, this time for non-compliance with removal orders. I scanned the paper, my eyes narrowing at the absurdity of the claim. According to their fabricated excuse, my car had now been classified as an abandoned vehicle, despite the fact that I had driven it less than an hour ago. It was a bold lie, one that crumbled under even the slightest scrutiny, but they didn't care about the truth, they cared about power. The tow truck's hydraulic arm groaned as it extended toward my front tires, metal clamps hovering just inches away from making contact. I clenched my fists, knowing that once they had my car, it would take months of legal battles to get it back, if I ever did at all. But before they could hook it, the sound of approaching sirens split through the tense air. The deputies stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances as two city enforcement vehicles rounded the corner and screeched to a stop in front of my house. The timing was almost poetic. I had barely finished speaking with the municipal office an hour ago, and yet, here they were, moving faster than I had anticipated. The lead city officer stepped out, her badge gleaming under the afternoon sun as she assessed the scene with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and suspicion. She approached the deputies, her presence alone shifting the balance of power. I watched as she pulled out her tablet, scanning through records, her eyebrows slowly knitting together as she pieced together what was happening. Then, without hesitation, she turned to the tow truck driver and ordered him to stand down. The ripple effect was immediate. The deputies hesitated, unsure whether to push their authority or back off, but the city's presence had changed the game. This wasn't just a resident protesting a ticket anymore, this was an internal jurisdictional battle between the sheriff's department and the city's legal enforcement. I saw the way the lead officer's lips pressed into a thin line as she flipped through citation records, her sharp gaze moving between the paper in my hands and the deputies who had issued them. I didn't need to hear what she was saying to know exactly what was happening. They had crossed a line, one that even their usual methods of intimidation couldn't cover up. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind as she realized the full extent of what had been going on. One citation might have been dismissed as a mistake, even two could be explained away, but this? This was a deliberate abuse of power, and she wasn't about to ignore it. The lead officer turned to me, her voice measured as she asked me to confirm my address, my property ownership, my legal right to park in my own driveway. I answered each question with unwavering certainty, knowing that every word I spoke was another nail in the sheriff's coffin. The deputies had stopped speaking altogether, their composure slipping as the city officials methodically tore apart their fabricated justification. Then came the moment that changed everything. The lead officer made a single call, one that sent a ripple of tension through the air. Moments later, a second set of sirens approached, this time carrying a representative from the district attorney's office. The deputies had pushed too far, and now they were caught in a situation they couldn't talk their way out of. What had started as a simple citation had spiraled into something far bigger, something they no longer had the power to contain. And as I stood there, watching the sheriff's men realize the weight of what they had done, I knew this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't just mine anymore, it was about to become a citywide reckoning. The weight of the moment settled over the street like an approaching storm, thick with unspoken tension as the district attorney's representative stepped out of his car. His arrival sent an unmistakable signal. This wasn't just about a parking dispute anymore. The sheriff's deputies, who had once stood with an air of quiet authority, now looked uneasy, shifting uncomfortably as the city's legal forces converged around them. The tow truck operator, sensing the shift in power, remained frozen, his hands hovering over the controls as if uncertain whether to proceed or retreat. Neighbors who had gathered on their porches now stepped closer, their curiosity giving way to something more urgent, more personal. They had seen this play out before, the quiet bullying tactics, the manufactured violations, the slow, methodical stripping away of people's rights under the guise of law and order. But now, for the first time, someone had forced the system to turn its gaze inward, to question those who had long operated unchecked. The district attorney's representative wasted no time, pulling out a folder thick with documents, flipping through them with a practiced ease that suggested he had already been briefed on the situation. He listened as the lead city officer recounted what had transpired, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more rigid with each new detail. I watched as he turned to the deputies, his eyes sharp, expectant. For a moment, they hesitated, their rigid stance faltering, as if calculating whether to stand their ground or concede to the inevitable. The lead deputy finally spoke, his voice measured but lacking the confidence he had displayed earlier. He insisted that they had acted within the boundaries of enforcement, that the citation was legitimate, that they were merely following orders. But the problem with following orders was that it required those orders to be lawful, and under the scrutiny of the city and the district attorney's office, their justification unraveled with astonishing speed. The lead city officer pulled out a digital record, scrolling through the citations issued within the past several months. The pattern was undeniable, the targeted nature of the fines impossible to ignore. Not only had multiple homeowners in my area been repeatedly cited for fabricated violations, but every single case had originated from the sheriff's office rather than the city's legal enforcement division. That alone was enough to raise questions, but then she revealed something even more damning. The fine amounts were inconsistent, fluctuating wildly from one resident to another, with no clear criteria determining the severity of the penalties. Some residents had been fined hundreds of dollars for minor infractions, while others had been issued warnings for nearly identical offenses. And then there was the final, undeniable link. The financial records. A portion of these fines hadn't even made it into the city's treasury, instead disappearing into an untraceable processing system that bypassed standard governmental oversight. That was the breaking point. The district attorney's representative stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of authority as he announced that the sheriff's department would be placed under immediate review. The deputies exchanged quick glances, the reality of their situation setting in. This wasn't something they could ignore or brush aside. There would be questions, investigations, and worst of all for them, accountability. The lead deputy clenched his jaw, his face a mask of controlled frustration as he finally gave the order for the tow truck to leave. The driver, relieved to be dismissed from the unfolding legal chaos, wasted no time retracting his equipment, his tires kicking up dust as he backed away from my driveway and sped off down the street. The tension in the air seemed to lessen slightly, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The district attorney's representative turned to me, assuring me that this matter wouldn't end with just a dismissed citation. An independent audit would be launched, one that would trace every fine issued under the sheriff's directive, every dollar that had changed hands, every homeowner who had been forced into compliance under the threat of legal retaliation. And then, with a gravity that made my stomach tighten, he informed me that this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar complaints had surfaced in neighboring districts, whispers of homeowners being systematically pressured, their rights eroded by those sworn to protect them. I wasn't just exposing a single act of corruption, I had become the catalyst for something far larger, something that could shake the very foundations of how local enforcement operated. As the city officials finalized their reports, I turned to see my neighbors watching in stunned silence. Some looked relieved, others wary, as if unsure whether to celebrate or brace for whatever came next. They had lived under this pressure for too long, conditioned to accept the slow erosion of their rights as an unavoidable part of life. But now, they had seen proof that it could be challenged, that the system wasn't as untouchable as it seemed. A shift had begun, subtle yet undeniable, and the sheriff's office had felt it too. The deputies left without another word, their departure lacking the confidence with which they had arrived. They had lost this battle, but I knew better than to assume the war was over. That night, long after the street had emptied and the legal officials had gone, I sat in my living room, staring at the neatly stacked documents on my coffee table. The fight wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about a citation or a parking dispute. It was about something far more insidious, the quiet ways power could be manipulated, the invisible lines that separated justice from control. And as I watched the notification light blink on my phone, signaling another message from the district attorney's office, I knew that this was far from finished. If the sheriff thought he could silence me with a citation, he had made a grave miscalculation. The city was watching now. The truth was out. And I was just getting started. The next morning, the weight of everything settled on my shoulders as I scrolled through the news headlines. The investigation had already begun to spread beyond my neighborhood, gaining traction in citywide discussions. Local reporters had picked up on the sudden review of the sheriff's department, linking it to long-standing rumors of financial discrepancies and abuse of authority. Some articles speculated about the motivations behind the fabricated citations, tying them to ongoing commercial development projects, while others focused on the unsettling pattern of homeowners being forced out under legal pressure. My name wasn't mentioned directly, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. This fight had started as a personal battle, but now, it had turned into something much larger, something that could no longer be ignored. As I stepped outside, I noticed something different, an unusual stillness in the neighborhood. The sheriff's patrol vehicle, which had once been a near-permanent fixture parked at the end of my street, was gone. No deputies loitered nearby, no citations were taped to doors under the cover of night, and no tow trucks lurked in the distance waiting to seize vehicles under flimsy pretenses. It was a strange kind of victory, one that felt both immediate and temporary, as if the forces that had once tightened their grip on this neighborhood had finally loosened, at least for now. But I knew better than to believe it was over. Power didn't disappear that easily, it just found new ways to reassert itself. By the time I arrived at the municipal building for my scheduled follow-up meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. What had once been a quiet, bureaucratic space now buzzed with tension and urgency. A team of legal officials, auditors, and representatives from the city council had convened to review the unfolding investigation. They had already begun combing through financial records, tracing the path of each dollar collected through citations, mapping out where the money had gone and who had benefited from it. And with every new revelation, the case against the sheriff's department grew stronger. More residents had come forward, their voices steady but laced with the weight of years of silent frustration. Some had paid their fines without question, believing the system was simply flawed but fair, while others had fought back only to find themselves buried under endless legal threats. The pattern was undeniable. The truth was out, and now, there was no stopping the momentum. By midday, a formal announcement had been made: the sheriff's department would be placed under an external audit, its leadership forced to answer for the sudden surge of targeted fines. Several key officials were suspended pending review, their authority stripped as investigators dug deeper into years of questionable enforcement tactics. It was a victory, but it was also just the beginning. A system built on corruption didn't collapse overnight, and I knew that even as the city took action, there would be resistance. Those who had profited from these abuses wouldn't give up their hold without a fight. But the difference now was that the fight was no longer happening in the shadows. The city was involved. The legal system was watching. The media had caught wind of the scandal, and with each new headline, the pressure mounted. That night, as I walked through my neighborhood, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time: relief. People who had once kept their heads down, who had quietly complied with the sheriff's rules to avoid conflict, now stood outside talking in hushed but hopeful voices. They had seen what happened when someone refused to be intimidated. They had witnessed power falter under the weight of its own corruption. And for the first time in years, there was a sense that change wasn't just possible, it was already happening. As I reached my driveway, I glanced at the empty curbside where the patrol car had once lingered. The silence that filled its absence wasn't one of fear anymore, but of something new. Of something earned. Of a battle that wasn't just mine, but one that had belonged to an entire community. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, I realized that while the fight wasn't over, I had already won the most important battle of all, the battle to remind people that their rights weren't privileges to be taken away, but something worth defending. No matter how powerful the opposition.